So there I was, working on my WrestleMania 30 video, writing the script, watching clips to get inspired, editing, when suddenly deja vu hit me up like... Now, I was only planning on watching the wrestling scene, and I actually did go back to my WrestleMania script after I watched this scene, but no matter what I did, from that point on, all that I could think about was Shrek. So I sat down to watch it again, and that's when I thought to myself, why is Shrek so popular? Now, you might be looking at that question and thinking to yourself, well, obviously because it's a good movie, and you'd be right. Come to think of it, actually, I don't think I've ever met a single person who flat out disliked Shrek, let alone hated it. I mean, hell, it was the first movie to ever win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. Did it deserve it over Monsters, Inc? No comment. Shrek has multiple sequels, holiday specials, musicals, miniseries, merchandise. Practically everywhere you go, you're liable to see some Shrek-related media. Shrek has endured throughout the years as a timeless classic that is still watched and loved to this day. But the more that I think about Shrek, the more I wonder if it's remembered for the movie or for the memes that it produced. See, it's pretty well known by this point that the first Shrek movie is a staple of the meme community. So much so to the point where it can, at times, appear to be on the same level of other immortal memes like Peppa and Doge. I've even heard some people compare the first Shrek movie to Star Wars and Spider-Man 3, for the simple fact that almost every scene of these three movies has been turned into a meme template. And yes, I understand that they're not referring to the quality of the movies being similar, but the moment that these three movies get put in the same category is where I officially get curious. So I looked into it. And it turns out that there's actually a lot of points in history which can be used to identify when Shrek officially became a meme. But from what I can find, it wasn't until the Shrek is Love, Shrek is Life copy pastas of 2012 that really started the downward spiral for Shrek's image in pop culture. But is that really how this movie is doomed to be remembered? Being overlooked by its sequels simply because the internet has labeled it as nothing more than a joke? Well, that's why I'm here. What I want to do with this video is analyze Shrek with the mindset of somebody judging it as a piece of art, completely free from the knowledge of the memes that will one day plague it, and determine once and for all just how good that it is as a film. Not an animated movie, not a joke, not a precursor to arguably better sequels, but as a standalone film. Because every film deserves that treatment in my mind. And yes, that includes you two. I honestly think that I must have watched Shrek about a dozen times on Cartoon Network growing up. But if I'm being completely honest, I never really paid much attention to it until deciding to make this video. Growing up, I would just always have it on in the background while I played Pokemon Platinum or I did homework or something else. Not because the film was boring or anything, I just never got the chance to actually sit down and watch the movie all the way through until now. But now that I've actually gotten the chance to watch Shrek in its entirety with the mindset of judging it as a film, I think that Shrek might actually be one of my new favorite films. Now, I don't know if it's like top 5 status or anything, but it's definitely on the list. The thing is though, even if I did get the chance to watch Shrek in its entirety growing up, I don't think that I would have held the same opinion when I was younger that I do now. I genuinely believe that I would have thought this movie was just okay and left it at that. Because while Shrek does have lots of gross-out humor and plenty of funny moments to entertain children, Shrek is a much more adult film than people ever gave it credit for. And no, I'm not just talking about the use of swear words throughout the movie.
Stubborn jackass!
Shrek is filled to the brim with tons of adult themes, language, imagery, and just overall is targeted at an older audience than people ever realized, which has played a significant role in its seemingly never-ending popularity, since the same kids who grew up watching it are now mature enough to understand its themes and appreciate it more. Whereas with other films you might have enjoyed as a kid and then ended up cringing to as an adult, with Shrek, the older that you get, the better it gets. And the main reason why Shrek gets better with age is due to the relatability of its main character. Shrek is established very early on as a guy who has accepted the role handed to him in life by society. For as long as he can remember, he has been on his own, branded a monster, and treated like an outcast for simply being an ogre. But the movie doesn't use this fact to try to tug on your heartstrings straight away, instead placing us in Shrek's shoes and showing us how Shrek deals with this part of his life, which it turns out is just pretending like it's natural and wholeheartedly embracing it, while accompanied by Smash Mouth to once again drive the point home that this movie won't follow conventional fairy tale tropes. Shrek treating his role as the monster normal kind of makes sense when you think about it, since being a monster is all that he's ever known. As far as we know, Shrek's never been told that he could be anything else. So he chooses to compensate for his rejection by going out of his way to be the worst monster that he can possibly be. Shrek is a man who has given up on the idea that he can find affection in his life, which is made clear by the fact that the first line that he speaks in the movie is a mockery of the idea of happy endings, until one day when he runs into Donkey. If there's a reason why the relationship between Donkey and Shrek feels very familiar to you, it's because it might just be a little similar to another iconic duo from a lot of our childhoods. Emplemons covers the topic of SpongeBob and Squidward's relationship better than I ever could, so I recommend watching his video. But a lot of the same principles that he talks about apply to the dynamic between Shrek and Donkey as well. Obviously, it's not an exact copy, but the way in which they handle their problems throughout the story and their way of thinking is very similar to that of SpongeBob and Squidward's dynamic. Donkey is a direct contrast to Shrek's personality. He's energetic, childish, happy, and yet despite all that, even though we never find out what his backstory is, this line here hints at his life possibly being just as lonely as Shrek's has been.
Please, I don't want to go back there. You don't know what it's like to be considered a freak. Well, maybe you do, but that's why we gotta stick together.
It's never confirmed, but I think it's safe to assume that Shrek and Donkey shared very similar upbringings in life, both of them being labeled as a freak and as a result shunned, which only makes their dynamic that much more interesting since, despite them both being in the same boat, much like SpongeBob and Squidward, their outlooks on their crappy situation and how they cope with it are vastly different. Whereas Shrek accepts his role and embraces it by attempting to scare away anyone who tries to get close to him, Donkey maintains hope and continues to attempt to connect to the people around him. Is it annoying? Oh hell yeah, but at least he's trying. The scene where Donkey follows Shrek home is one of the best in the entire movie, and sets the stage for what, in my opinion, really makes this movie so well remembered 20 years later. That being, of course, the dialogue. The dialogue in Shrek is fantastic, letting the comedy and the characterization shine through the voice actors and how they interact with one another, as opposed to the joke setups like in the other Shrek movies. But the dialogue between Donkey and Shrek in particular is what stands out the most to me in this movie. As far as we know, Shrek's never had anyone attempt to be his friend before, so when Donkey begins to follow him, he tries to scare him away. Partially because that's all that Shrek knows how to do, but also because he's kind of annoying. So he asks him, "Aren't you bothered by the fact that I'm an ogre?" And when Donkey tells him no, the voice line delivery by Mike Myers is spot on and emotion-packed, sounding surprised with just a hint of subdued happiness at the possibility of someone wanting to be his friend.
Really?
All in one single word. The dialogue in Shrek is simplistic and relatable, which is why so many of us can quote this movie word for word to this day. The entire movie is littered with emotion and the simplicity of its dialogue, since it makes the characters more relatable and memorable. Also, side note before I end this segment, I've heard an interesting theory that when Donkey asks what Shrek's name is, he just made it up on the spot since he was never given a name by anyone in his life, which I don't know if it's true or not, but it would explain why Shrek has to think about it before actually giving him his name. But then again, he could just be taken off guard by the fact that someone actually cares enough to ask what his name is, but whatever, either way it works. Flash forward to later that night, where the film's villain, Lord Farquaad, has sent all of the fairy tale creatures from earlier to go and live in Shrek's swamp, far away from their homes. Shrek, understandably, is not too happy at the idea of having hundreds of different people living in his house, so he sets off with Donkey to go and talk to Lord Farquaad. Now, if I'm being honest here, I really didn't feel like talking about Lord Farquaad in this video, But luckily for me, my friend Cynicide was more than willing to share his thoughts on Lord Farquaad, which means less work for me, so by all means, take it away, man.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Klooch. Now, typically when talking about villains, there are 3 different types. The sympathetic villain, the twist villain, and just the straight up villain. For the sympathetic villain, think Thanos in Infinity War. Maybe you don't 100% agree with what he's doing, but you see the motives behind it and you would understand why he would do it. For the twist villain, basically it's someone who either you didn't expect to be the villain, or the characters in the story didn't expect to be the villain. Just look at basically any Pixar movie in the 2000s and you'll find one. Mr. Waternoose, Lotso, and basically the whole team that worked on Cars 2. And finally, there's just the straight up villain. Now maybe this one isn't as compelling as the sympathetic villain or as shocking as the twist villain, but goddammit man, just watch any scene from the original Star Wars trilogy with Palpatine in it and you'll understand why I love this as much as I do. This guy is so unbelievably evil, and you can tell he is loving that shit. Now let's think about Farquaad for just a second, and which one of these categories do you think he fits in?
What are you doing here?
Really, it's rude enough being alive when no one wants you, but showing up uninvited.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of obvious. I mean, his name is Farquaad. It's clear that you aren't supposed to like this guy. But what if I told you that Lord Farquaad even takes it a step further than the normal, just straight up villain? Yeah, Palpatine is evil, but in the literal introduction to this character, he is torturing Gingy, this lovable little guy, and he's tearing his goddamn legs off. Farquaad is a despicable asshole, which is what you need when the protagonist is an ogre, which typically plays the role of the bad guy in other forms of media. Once again, I'm going to bring it back to Star Wars. In the first movie, and really the second one too, Darth Vader was the big opposing force to the main characters, which is why Palpatine is so evil in the third movie, so that he's worse than Vader and that so his redemption at the end of the movie is believable. While Shrek isn't nearly as bad as Darth Vader, because Farquaad is as bad as he is, he's not only providing a target for the audience to hate, but he also props up Shrek as the movie's likable protagonist. All of that, on top of the fact he has some of the most quotable lines in the movie, is why I think Farquaad is so effective as a villain, and why I think, unironically, that he is one of DreamWorks' best villains.
Thanks for helping out, Cynicide. And while we're on the topic of Lord Farquaad, this is actually a really good point to transition over to my next segment, because if you somehow hadn't already realized just how much that Shrek prides itself on its musical storytelling, the establishing scene of Lord Farquaad will definitely get the job done. I won't lie to you guys, music theory, and just music in general, are not exactly my area of expertise, so I apologize if I sound unprofessional when discussing this portion of my video. But I just wouldn't feel right analyzing Shrek without at least attempting to talk about its music. Shrek is a movie that understands the significance that a score can make on a film, and composes itself around the action of the film so well, I honestly feel like some of these scenes were animated around the music, and not the other way around like is typically done. The first time that I noticed this was during the film's villain introduction, where we see Lord Farquaad walking down a hallway. From the second the music starts, in the audience's mind, there is no mistaking that we're about to be introduced to the villain. It starts off menacing and powerful, featuring loud drum beats and chanting. But as we slowly get a better look at what Lord Farquaad looks like, the music begins to pick up a little, transitioning into an organ and other higher-pitched instruments, until we finally see a full-body shot of what is supposed to be our film's big, bad, intimidating villain, in direct comparison to one of his soldiers. It's comedic, and almost immediately in the audience's mind, the tension is deflated, and as such, the music deflates too, almost going out of key as it fades out, as if the soundtrack were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of what its movie's villain was supposed to be. Throughout the film, you can find multiple examples of the score coinciding with what we see on screen. My personal favorite being the music that plays when Shrek and Fiona and Donkey are running away from the dragon. But most people don't really talk about Shrek's actual score. What most people seem to remember from Shrek's soundtrack are its pop culture song additions, like All-Star, Bad Reputation, and so on and so forth, which play a big role in the film's storytelling since it fulfills two roles simultaneously, that being to coincide with the film's action, but also to remind the audience constantly that you're not watching some kiddie fairy tale. I would go more in-depth with Shrek's music, but Sideways already covered this topic way better than I ever could, so I suggest watching that video if you want to hear more about Shrek's soundtrack. Also, since I already brought up this scene, I might as well talk about it because I don't even know where to begin talking about this scene. I'm honestly struggling to find the right words to describe why I like this scene so much outside of because it's cool. Because it just is. The scene where Shrek saves Fiona and Donkey has everything that makes a Shrek film a Shrek film. It's not as good as Shrek 2's holding out for a hero segment, but it's definitely on par with the potion escape scene. You could show somebody who's never even heard of Shrek this scene, and they would perfectly understand what this entire franchise is all about. You get it all. Shrek's down-to-earth personality contrasted by Fiona's polite and royal manner, gross-out humor, adult humor, donkey annoying Shrek, amazing action scenes showcasing just how smart Shrek is, and an amazing score which, like I said in my last segment, complements everything on the screen to near perfection. Seriously, who composed this movie's score? Well, that would explain a lot. But honestly though, I could watch this scene over and over again and never get bored. And while I'm on the subject of amazing scenes from this movie, there are so many great scenes in this movie, but the Starry Night scene is without a doubt the most uncomfortably real and emotional moment in not just Shrek, but any movie that I've seen in a while. There's no danger, nobody coming to steal Fiona away, nobody looking to kill Shrek or Donkey. Yet. It is simply two guys looking at the stars, talking about life. It starts off like how you'd expect Shrek to go, with a fart joke.
There's Bloodnut, the flatulent. You can guess what he's famous for.
But it quickly takes a turn as Shrek tells Donkey that as soon as he gets his swamp back, he's going to build a wall in order to keep people away from him. It hurts the audience to hear this just as much as it does Donkey, since we've already seen these two go through so much together. But unlike last time where Donkey just does as Shrek says and leaves him alone, this time he decides to push him, questioning him on exactly why he wants to be alone. And it's in this little exchange where my statement about the simplicity of this movie's dialogue making it more emotional holds the most weight. The tension in this scene is palpable, and it keeps building between them until finally, Shrek breaks, and admits what the audience already knows.
People take one look at me and go, "Ah, help, run! A big, stupid, ugly ogre." They judge me before they even know me. That's why I'm better off alone.
Shrek doesn't move on from this part of his life. He hasn't learned to cope with it in a more healthy way. He hasn't found a solution to the problem. He simply admits that he has a problem in the first place, after which Donkey sits down next to him to comfort him. Besides the voice actors doing a fantastic job here to make it sound as real as possible, there's no music during this conversation, at least not until the very end. Instead, the movie places yourself in their shoes and forces you to listen to the uncomfortable silence mixed with two friends confronting each other about their problems. The scene is also used to progress the plot since Fiona overhears the conversation and, as a result, begins to relate to Shrek more. Speaking of which, how have I made it this far into my video without talking about Fiona? Gather around, because it's time for story time with Klooch. A long time ago, there was a man named Jeffrey Katzenberg. He worked for Disney, producing hit films like Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, but then slowly over the course of a few years, he began to have a falling out with Disney over executive positions at the company opening up. He was told that if the position was vacated for a 2-year period or more, he would be able to... Hey, stay awake! Okay, fine. Long story short, these two guys fought a lot. So eventually Jeffrey Katzenberg left Disney to go found DreamWorks Animation Studios. Take a wild guess what one of their first films was. Now, the reason why I'm telling you all this stuff is because I can't really talk about Fiona and what her character is like without first putting into perspective the circumstances in which this film was created under. You see, Jeffrey Katzenberg was not happy with Disney, which, trust me, I completely understand. And nowhere is his disdain for the Disney Corporation more prominently put on display than it is here in this movie. From the very first scene, we are read a very generic Disney knight saves the princess type story, which Shrek immediately wipes his ass with. Duloc is literally designed from the ground up to be a mockery of Disneyland. But last but not least, most prominently, and the focus of this chapter, Fiona is a princess who does not act like a princess. She starts off in the story pretending to act like a princess, having been taught since she was young stories about Prince Charming and how he will one day rescue her from the castle and they'll live happily ever after. But as they all head back to Duloc and Fiona and Shrek start to fall for each other, we see just how truly special that she is. She knows how to defend herself, she likes gross-out humor just like Shrek does, she literally turns into an ogre. It's clear that Fiona is not what you would normally think of when you hear the word princess. But that's kind of the whole point of her character. Actually, it's kind of the whole point of this movie, but it shines through the most with Fiona. She's a bait and switch on what we've come to expect from the stereotypical damsel in distress princess trope. Like I said, Shrek and Fiona start to flirt like crazy with one another as they head back to Duloc, even going so far as to fake reasons for why they have to camp the night, just so that way they get to spend one extra night with each other. However, despite their natural chemistry and all that they go through, they still end up getting pulled away from each other. Now, I hear a lot of people complain about this part of the movie, saying how it's forced and that it's just a stupid, oh, he heard the wrong part of the conversation, but he'll come around when he knows the full story climax. But as far as I'm concerned, that's not the case. Shrek and Fiona aren't honest with each other. It's not like Shrek told Fiona how he felt and then he heard things out of context. Shrek and Fiona are both unable to come clean with each other about how they feel due to their own insecurities. And that's the biggest reason why I didn't want to talk about Farquaad earlier, because as far as I'm concerned, he's not the villain of this story. He's certainly a key player and a villain, but the true villain of this movie that plagues our main characters at every turn is Shrek's own insecurities, and his complete refusal to accept the idea that he could ever be loved. It's his insecurities that keep him from admitting how he feels to Fiona, that make him assume that Fiona called him ugly without knowing the full story, and that lead to him abandoning Donkey. Mike Myers does a perfect job voicing Shrek during this scene, and you really get the impression that Shrek is on the verge of crying when Mike Myers is delivering some of these lines.
You're great pals, aren't you? I live alone. My swamp. Me. Nobody else. Understand? Nobody.
Despite how much that Shrek has matured and opened up throughout the journey, he just can't get over his own insecurities. At the very least, when he was on his own, he knew that everyone hated him and had somewhat learned to make peace with that. And even if it's not true, the mere idea of the people he's let himself become close to hating him too is just too much for him to bear. He just can't let go of the idea that he will always be alone. And so he heads back home to the swamp, where in his mind, he belongs. Luckily though, Donkey ain't having that shit. It's interesting to see how Donkey progresses through this movie. He starts off doing whatever Shrek says, then at the midpoint during the Starry Night sequence, he starts to feel more confident and push Shrek's buttons a bit more. Until we reach the final confrontation between them, where he tells Shrek straight up to his face just what a bad friend that he's been to him, and tells him how all that he does is push away the people in life who do care about him. They make up in a surprisingly touching way, Shrek even restating a line from the Starry Night sequence that he shared with Donkey.
I guess I am just a big, stupid, ugly ogre.
And they set off so that Shrek can tell Fiona how he feels before the wedding. When Shrek shows up to stop the wedding and tell Fiona how he feels, Fiona reveals to everyone her true form. Farquaad takes this well.
This marriage is binding, and that makes me king! See? See?
And is eaten by the dragon, which is now dating Donkey. Yeah, I can't make that statement not weird, so just go along with it. Our two lovers have their moment together, but when the kiss seems to have failed, Fiona remaining an ogre, Shrek simply says, "No, it didn't fail. You are beautiful." Because at the end of the day, it's not about how you look, it's about how you act. And Shrek, realizing this through Fiona's transformation, or lack thereof, can now take that first step to beginning to accept himself for who he is. We then end the movie off on what is honestly the best song choice in the entire series. Shrek starts the movie off mocking the idea of happy endings, but he ends the movie a full-fledged believer, because now Shrek believes that anyone can find happiness, that everybody deserves a chance to find their true love, and that anybody who wants happiness will one day find it. Ending the movie off the same way that it began, with the flip of a book page. So, how would I sum up Shrek? Well, it's honestly sad that Shrek became a meme all these years later, because I feel like a lot of people would benefit from the messages this movie tries to tell. It's not a perfect movie. I know that I defended the misheard conversation part of the movie, but if I'm being honest, I would probably replace that for something else if I was writing this movie. Plus, some of the animation really doesn't hold up today. But for as many flaws that I am able to dig up on this movie, I just can't stop loving it. Shrek is a one-of-a-kind movie that I honestly don't think will ever be replicated. But that's kinda what makes Shrek so relevant today. Not the memes and the shitposts, not the pop culture songs, not the voice cast, not the adult humor. The fact that there will never be another Shrek is what makes it stand out in all our hearts as a timeless classic. And while I may not have given it much attention as a kid, I'm glad that I decided to make this video, because it gave me the chance to finally sit down and enjoy this film as an adult. I know this Shrek video interrupted my work on the WrestleMania 30 video, and don't worry, that video is coming, I promise. But before I release that video, there's still one more animated movie from my childhood that I have to give the same treatment and respect as I just did Shrek. Stay tuned for next time, because I've got a lot to say.